And with this, I think we should leave the floor to Richard.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to talk about what Pillar 1 has in abundance, and that is challenges. So I'm going to be looking at certain challenges in Pillar 1, and I'm going to try and say how we're responding to them. In the time available, I'm going to comment on 3, which are, firstly, the central issue being the task of developing a response to the digitalisation of business. Secondly, I'll make some comments on exploring the commonalities of the 3 approaches that have been suggested initially in the programme of work. And then 3, I'm going to say a little bit more about managing the interconnection with the ALP. So I'm going to start first with developing a response to the digitalisation of business. Now, the context of this is obviously the 3 proposals. The starting point is the 3 proposals that have been made: the marketing intangible, the user participation, and the significant economic presence. They represent different strands of thinking, different concepts, applications, and results. So bringing those together is obviously going to be a challenge. But then, if you think about what the task that is presented involves, it involves, for reasons I'll repeat, but I think I'll explore in a minute, but I think it's pretty obvious, is that the task requires something quite new to be done in very many ways. That means that there are no ready mechanisms, no ready infrastructure. It would be very tempting to conclude that it's all just not possible. But actually, in the context of the real world and the task that's been assigned here, that would not be especially helpful. It's not just any response. There's not the luxury of starting with a blank piece of paper in perhaps the way the RPAI that John's going to talk about has had that ability. This is a response that's constrained or informed by a number of different factors or goals. So obviously, most obviously, we have to deal with the digitalisation of business. But it is absolutely critical that we recognise that whatever solution is developed has to be suitable for the 130 odd members of the inclusive framework. That means it has to be simple. There's an enormously strong theme in the thinking and the discussion so far about administrability and avoiding or reducing disputes. And then there's the realpolitik of it all. There is absolutely no point developing or pursuing ideas that will not actually be adopted in the real world. And so the efforts to build a solution have to take account of the differing view of states. And there's that little matter of time too. How do we respond to that? Well, in the Secretariat, we're generally guided by the test of trying to do the least complex thing in what we do. I'd love to say that the most easy, but actually nothing is easy. And so saying that we're trying to do the easiest thing would be to really give you a false impression about the nature of the task. So it's the least complex thing. Try to keep it simple. There are broadly 2 strands to the response in the context of what I've already said. This is the response that's underway. Firstly, there's a focus, the work within the Secretariat and within the working parties is seeking to focus on the commonalities. Sometimes that's described as a horizontal approach. What that means is across the 3 methods, what are the commonalities to those methods? It's those that we're particularly focused on the basis that might identify matters. We might help the steering group arrive at a decision in relation to the way forward. A good example, for example, might be business line. Whether we would approach this on the basis of recognising different business lines or whether we might approach this on the basis of different regions or regions by business lines. So the questions we might look at are, should we do that from a policy perspective? And then obviously, can we do that? Can we do that within the constraints of coming up with something that is simple and administrable and relevant to all? I'll come back to this point in a moment. The second strand is trying to look at possibilities for a unified approach, and Pascal referred to this. The process for that is try to think about what's on the table, ways we might bring the approaches together, open a dialogue with delegates to see what might fly and what might not, see if we can identify red lines. The practical difficulty of that is the relationship between a skeleton of thinking and the detail. You might develop a skeleton of an idea, but normally when you float that, this is my experience, when you float that, you immediately get asked about 1,000 details. And so the process is well, it's work in progress, but it's not straightforward. Let me turn to the commonalities of the three approaches. This is the three approaches: the marketing intangible, the user participation, and the SEP. The commonalities that are expressed in the program of work, obviously the starting point is the three methods that have been proposed, and the commonalities that are expressly referred to in the program of work are the following. Going beyond the ALP, I'm not sure it's beyond, it could be above, below, going in a different dimension to the ALP. Secondly, the establishment of nexus in the market or user jurisdiction in the absence of a physical presence. Thirdly, looking at the total profit of a business beyond or above, etc., the single entity approach. So that involves looking at group profit or some kind of measure of aggregated profit. And then four, the use of simplifying conventions to reduce compliance costs, I should say, and dispute. Now, those elements are reflected in the three building blocks in the program of work. And those three building blocks are the new nexus rule, the profit allocation rule, and issues relating to implementation and administration, including the elimination of double tax and resolution of disputes. All of those commonalities bring their own challenges. Firstly, going beyond the ALP raises the whole question of the relationship with the ALP, and I want to really finish on this point as the third area I wanted to comment on. Secondly, we clearly need to create a new nexus in the absence of physical presence. That's something that Sophie Chattel is talking about, so I won't try and replicate what I'm sure she'll do much better than I could. Thirdly, we need to look at the group or aggregated profits. So there's a whole range of issues that is inevitably going to raise. What is the measure of group or aggregated profits? How do we get to our base? Can we use some accounting measures? If that's not suitable, what other measures are available, and how does that tie into the mission to be not complex? And then if we use some measure of group profit or aggregated profit to reward the market or user jurisdiction, then we're going to need to convert that back, as Mike Williams was saying, into the essentially bilateral system that we operate. In other words, we're going to need to identify the entity or entities that we're going to treat as owning that income and being subject to the tax in the market jurisdiction. The fourth commonality relates to the use of simplifying conventions and proxies. Well, that's fine in principle, but are we going to be able to live with the inevitable trade-offs? We might take the view that we're trading off some kind of precision that we might otherwise achieve through the ALP, although I'll come back to that. I think that's a sort of slightly hopeful notion of the ALP, against administrability. Nothing is going to work without imperfections. And I must say, I was in hearing the discussion in the last session, I do feel bound to say that one's got to be realistic about what's going to be achieved in this project. We are simply not going to have a perfect solution to every problem in the international tax system. The third area I wanted to comment on is managing the interconnection with the ALP. We will need to manage this. We are not getting rid of the ALP. We're not getting rid of transfer pricing, which, depending upon the audience, is either a wonderful thing or a very, very bad thing. I'm still told almost daily that the arm's length principle should go in its entirety. Actually, still told that there's nothing wrong with the ALP as well, almost daily. Realistically, though, there is no political appetite to get rid of the ALP and transfer pricing, just none, and take on some new income allocation approach. It's simply not going to happen. Logistically and technically, it would be a massive undertaking. Now, that obviously means any approach must operate alongside or meld with the ALP. As I say, we can't just do a new system on a blank piece of paper. And obviously, if we're effectively having a single cake of profits within a group of companies, and we're cutting that by reference to two different systems, that means that we're starting off with a challenge to the avoiding complexity and achieving simplicity agenda that I've already referred to. So, I appreciate that moving beyond the ALP is obviously a very charged issue, and I can assure you from the feedback I get daily that it certainly is. As I mentioned, I'm often told, I believe on a daily basis, but that's not technically certain, but I'm often told that there's nothing, we shouldn't do this because it's plain wrong, because the arm's length principle operates okay. I think there was a shade of that in the discussion this morning from some quarters. And I think that's a highly doubtful proposition, actually. We can also see, as Pascal mentioned, various developments that indicate some degree of dissatisfaction with the ALP, and we can indeed see them in BEPS. In the BEPS package, there's a deliberate choice not to approach the regulation of interest through the thin capitalization approach that had been an OECD standard since the mid-1980s, but to use the fixed ratio approach. So I'm not sure it's realistic to say that we can just rely on the ALP. Now, I do appreciate the evolution in the ALP. In 1963, the commentary to the OECD model had a solitary and short paragraph of explanation on the ALP. It included the reference that the rule calls for very little comment. By 2009, the commentary had grown to 240 pages. By 2017, after BEPS, it had arrived at 600 pages. We clearly found a little more to comment on. It is, however, mysterious to me how the ALP can fix the proposed approaches, which all three self-evidently go beyond the ALP. The argument sometimes is that we should stretch or adapt the ALP to do what we want to do. But the wisdom of stretching in the context of everything I've described needs some thought. If we stretch the notion of blue to include green, we don't have blue anymore. And by analogy, I'm raising the question about if we're going to adapt and stretch the ALP in the way suggested. But by the way, I think that uses the term stretch and adapt in rather new ways. But I think we're going to end up with some rather amorphous concept of the ALP that is not fit for purpose. And as has already been indicated by Mike and Pascal, it is quite clear that and I'm saying as well, the ALP is being retained, and we need what we retain to operate with some integrity. In relation to the need for a new income allocation to best meld with the ALP, this is why there is a strong presence in the proposals on the residual profit split. It's not in the significant economic presence proposal, but it is reflected in the other two. Now, I'd make a couple of comments about this. Firstly, that the isolation of residual profits for our purposes reflects the wish to have the least possible impact on transfer pricing. In other words, if we're going to try and bring these two systems together, we should do it in a way that has the least impact on transfer pricing. Why? Because it's least complex. It's for that reason, it's that test. So that is achieved by at least the thinking that is reflected in the residual profit split. Now, arguably, the thinking in the residual profit split also facilitates the allocation of profits, of a single cake of profits, by different factors. Now, that would clearly be needed here if the profits are to be split under the two systems, the ALP system, the traditional income allocation system, and any new system. And actually, that's a really good example, in my mind, of how that operates, is the way that we've dealt with the problems in the global trading arena. And we've extensively used, the world has extensively used residual profits to bring together an allocation of profits by reference to two completely different factors, two apples and oranges, namely traders and capital. And that's become quite an orthodox way of doing it. So to my mind, that is the other benefit of the residual profit split, or at least the thinking in the residual profit split. Now, that clearly opens up the debate on the wisdom of targeting residual as against routine profits, and particularly the higher profits. But actually, on that point, that's something that Georgia and I have discussed in the past, and I think you were just going to comment.
Because I think it's so for many in the community. I think that these simplifying conventions are a bit worrying, because some of them could become turnover taxes, especially for low profitability groups, right? And for economists, turnover taxes are the worst thing you can do to the tax system. It would be actually a step back. So we are wondering, I think, all of us, how the OECD is going beyond this problem, which we think is a very fundamental problem, as fundamental as whether we want a new Article 5 and MLI 2 or something like that.
Okay. So to any practitioner, particularly any income allocation practitioner, as soon as I mention residual profit split, a light should go off that this doesn't seem to fit very well with the comments I made about simplicity and complexity. Residual profit splits tend not to get sorted out in a few days, or weeks, or months, or years. I mean, some are done in 2 or 3 years. They tend to be enormously difficult to do. So I just wanted to make clear that I am certainly not thinking that we're going to be applying traditional, and by the traditional, I mean OECD orthodox profit splits or residual profit splits, as they are known. I just don't think that is a viable solution. That's my personal view. I have actually in practice done residual profit splits for more than 20 years, and I understand how they're done and the complexity. They're also not common in many industries. I've already referred to the industry I tended to work in, which is in the financial sector. They're very common there. They're not common in many other industries, and there are a number of countries that simply couldn't do them, hardly heard of them. So my comments about the residual profit split should be taken as more the thinking behind the residual profit split, the idea that we might find a way, find a proxy for isolating the residual for the reasons that I've explained. So I take it that the thinking behind a residual profit split might offer something. Now, of course, then, this is the position of the proposal that does not embrace a residual profit split and actually takes a completely different tack of making no distinction between routine and residual. Now, the one issue here is whether we might, when we apply a formulaic and simplified approach, as we inevitably have to, we might see greater convergence through the operation of the formulaic simplified approach, the use of proxies. I think there's a possibility that we might be able to work towards some degree of greater convergence. And that note of greater convergence just seemed a wonderful place to stop my comments.
Thank you, Richard.